Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and today I'm going to take you through, today being actually May 10. This was when the Royal Proclamation was issued, bringing the new Dominion of Canada into being on July 1, 1867. So I'm going to take you through what was happening, the few years just before 1867 when this major step of self-government was granted by British Parliament, and give you a better sense of what Canada has really all been about. And as I take you through these examples, which underscore why I keep saying Canada is an outlaw nation, you should, those of you who are involved in either the negotiations of self-government or of the people wondering what exactly is going on at those tables, you should see some of the tactics that Canada used to create itself, if you will, being applied in hoping it will work on Indigenous nationals. And my main point in all of this is to say, is this the kind of foundation upon which you wish to proceed as Indigenous nationals, becoming merely domestic ethnic minorities under this basis? Or, and I'd like to suggest, the stronger foundation for moving forward is that which your people honorably worked out and followed for thousands of years. I want to describe to you just how much a baby Canada is and how it's still in the process of quote-unquote nation building, and how it's not even certain that that's going to succeed. And so without much more fronting this, I'd like to start taking you through, and this is again volume 28, The Fathers of Confederation. This was published in 1916. So of course it is the first 50 years of the Dominion of Canada that's under discussion. But again, a lot of what took place is not taught in schools. Canadians don't know about this. Certainly Indigenous nationals may not be aware. And I'd like to put it forward because in order, there's that saying, to know where you're going, you need to know where you came from. So what do you know of where Canadians came from? And this will be a bit lengthy. This will show you quite a vivid picture, I suggest, as to what Canada really is all about. And it should be noted that just before this, each province had its own constitution, its tariff, postage laws, and currency. It promoted its own interests regardless of the existence of its British neighbors. And this I didn't know until reviewing this book. The very currencies differ, said Lord Carnarvon in the House of Lords. In Canada, the pound or the dollar are legal tender. In Nova Scotia, the Peruvian, Mexican, Colombian dollars are all legal. In New Brunswick, British and American coins are recognized by law, though I believe that the shilling is taken at 24 cents, which is less than its value. In Newfoundland, Peruvian, Mexican, Colombian, Old Spanish dollars are all equally legal, whilst in Prince Edward's Island, the complexity of currencies and of their relative value is even greater. All the jealousy, the factious spirit, and the prejudice which petty local sovereignties are bound to engender flourished apace. So Canada is fostering, through approaching individual communities within nations and not nations as a whole, and certainly not acknowledging nationhood, encouraging this, which is described, this fighting amongst each other instead of working together for the bigger picture, if you will. The effects of separate political development and of divided interest were deeply rooted. Leaders of opinion in the various provinces and even men of the same province refused to join hands for any great national purpose. So what Canada was experiencing, and what I suggest Canada is foisting and has through the application of the Indian Act, has worked to break down the nations into setting this kind of stage of fighting against each other, not being able to work together for any quote-unquote national purpose, being in purposes of Indigenous nations, in this case that I'm speaking. And it's talking about, and you'll hear this so many times, for decades now, the answer to, well, there's Indigenous sovereignty, they can do things. Canada always reverts to this concept of selling their initiative of the day. Well, that's not practical, you know. This is a time where we owe the introduction of the policy into practical politics. And this is a cover to basically say, well, it's not completely legal. It doesn't reflect the legal facts, but this is a practical way to proceed. And the establishing of Canada as a dominion is fraught with so much of that. This is this handy little turn of phrase, what's practical. And this is exactly what Harvard School of Governance has done in terms of breaking down and watering down concepts of sovereignty. They said, well, it's really practical sovereignty. And the only thing that's practical Canada and these Harvard principles sell to Indian bands is that, well, the only thing practical is for you to do your own individual constitution, become like a municipality, and govern your own internal affairs. There's nothing really practical about that. Is it practical to not be in control of your economy? Is it practical not to be in control and be able to exercise your economic sovereignty? This is, just because Canada achieved results for itself using these tactics and principles doesn't mean it's in the interests of Indigenous nationals to fall victim to the same same strategies applied to them. Because after all, Canada's in this for themselves, the Canadian governments. They want what Indigenous nations have. A situation which arose out of the Civil War in the United States neither created nor carried Confederation, but it resulted through a sense of common danger in bringing the British provinces together and giving full play to all the forces that were making for their union. So the provinces, despite the petty sovereignty, jurisdictional issues, the not being able to work together, they came together from a sense of common danger. And I put it to you, Indigenous communities of Indigenous nations, you are in the presence of great danger. And this ought to be a unifying moment for you in order to respond to that great danger, because after all, it is your very existence as nations that's at stake. So again, there was political deadlock in terms of how to come together in Canada. The absence of large issues had encouraged a senseless rivalry between individuals. And again, that's, this being separate and operating this sense of rivalry between individuals. This is so dominant in politics on reserve, right? And then as they were moving forward with this, I appreciate they had conferences. It was all done in secrecy. There were individual delegates. The people were not told, and the reporters, the media, were kept out. And the only kinds of things that came forward is just like what we see in the Anishinaabe Nation Governance Agreement. Again, thank you for the warning sirens. Not planned, but so very much so. The sharing of propaganda. And let me just read to you, the kind of thing that was issued at this time, just before 1867. In these colonies, as heretofore governed, we have enjoyed great advantages under the protecting shield of the mother country. We have had no army or navy to sustain, no foreign diplomacy to sustain. Our whole resources have gone to our internal improvement, And notwithstanding our occasional strifes with the colonial office, we have enjoyed a degree of self-government and generous consideration such as no colonies in ancient or modern history ever enjoyed at the hands of a parent state. Is it any wonder that thoughtful men should hesitate to countenance a step that might change the happy and advantageous relations we have occupied towards the mother country? I am persuaded that there never was a moment in the history of these colonies when the hearts of our people were so firmly attached to the parent state by the ties of gratitude and affection as at this moment. And for one, I hesitate not to say that did this movement for colonial union endanger the connection that has so long and so happily existed, it would have my firm opposition. These and other utterances, equally forceful and appealing directly to the pride and ambition of the country, were not without effect in molding public opinion. The tour was a campaign of education. This is the sort of promoting of one view. You know, it's good to come under Canada. It's good to do these self-government agreements. Ironically, being a lawyer, she should have understood how misleading her statement was when in the Liberal government, Jody Wilson-Raybould kept saying, we're going to complete Confederation. Well, Confederation's completed. There's no intention, and I've said this earlier, there's no intention, Trudeau's been clear about that, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said we're not opening up the Constitution. So from the Liberal government's perspective, Confederation's done. All they're doing is trying to get rid of the treaties. They're trying to get control, full control over all the lands, which continue to remain in the ownership of the Indigenous Nations. How do we know that? You just look at the treaties. The language is all there. But, the people are being told, look, this is us exercising our jurisdiction, and they don't get to see the agreements. They don't have access to legal advice that someone like me, for instance, can look through and say, do you realize what this is really doing? Do you know you're capitulating? Do you know you're giving up? Do you realize these representations that are being made? They're completely contrary to your Indigenous law. Do you appreciate the consequences of going against your ancestors and your Indigenous law? Those consequences are very severe, and Indigenous nationals still know about that. So again, here we move to their efforts. This is a Quebec conference that took place on October 10, 1864. They were to prove that a new nationality could be created. Didn't exist. Remember, Canada, not a nation at this time. The British North America Act passed, not a nation, right? Just steps of self-government, but not yet a nation. Consider that against the thousands of years of Indigenous nationality. They were here to prove that a new nationality could be created which should retain intact the connection with the mother country. And this is an interesting point, and we noted that the Constitution was not chiefly the product of legal minds. So-and-so and others who shared largely in the work of construction were not lawyers. Again, this concept of this is practical, may not be legal, but it's practical. But lawyers would not be able to sign off on that. So there's a reason lawyers were not the fathers of Confederation. There are reasons that these people did not have those legal backgrounds, because if they did, they would understand that what they were proposing and how they were stating things at times were not, it wouldn't be possible to proceed on that basis. But these people proceeded because they saw that as a practical way to achieve the outcome they desired. It says it has to be recorded too that the conclusions reached were criticized as the product of men in a hurry. Remember, this is not the people of Canada. This is a few people, self-selected, if you will. Sound familiar? Who are the people that set up structures? Who are the people that self-selected to go negotiate and contribute. They didn't negotiate, but be consulted on the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Who are the self-selected incorporators of companies and lobby groups? The people who, under Indigenous law, retain the power of consent, never provided consent for these structures. And so, as I was mentioning, this was kept under privacy, and the undersigned representatives of English and Canadian newspapers find that it would be impossible for them to satisfactorily discharge their duties if an injunction of secrecy be imposed on the conference and stringently carried into effect. They therefore beg leave to suggest whether they could then, be allowed access. It's just such a, allowing us in. Such a course would have the further advantage of preventing ill-founded and mischievous rumors regarding the proceedings from obtaining currency. This ingenious appeal was signed by S. Phillips Day of the London Morning Herald, by Charles Lindsay of the Toronto Leader, and by Brown Chamberlain of the Montreal Gazette. And there was a bunch of writers of distinction from a bunch of very reputable newspapers. Quote, but the conference stood firm, and the impatient correspondents were denied even the mournful satisfaction of brief daily protocols. They were forced to be content with overhearing the burst of cheering from the delegates when MacDonald's motion proposing federation was unanimously adopted. The reasons for maintaining strict secrecy were thus stated by John Hamilton Gray, a delegate from New Brunswick. After much consideration, it was determined, as in Prince Edward Island, that the convention should hold its deliberations with closed doors. Liberals and conservatives had there met to determine what was best for the future guidance of half a continent, not to fight old party battles. It's important to note, liberals and conservatives today are still bound by the same principle of trying to obtain control and ownership away from Indigenous nations. In his longhand notes found among the papers of Sir John Macdonald and made public 30 years later by Sir Joseph Pope, we have the only official record of the resolutions and debates of the conference. This is not, of course, independent recording, remember, as media would you expect media to provide. Posterity has reason to be grateful for even this limited revelation on the proceedings from day to day. It enables us to form an idea of the difficulties overcome and of the currents of opinion which combine to give the measure its final shape. The various draft motions, we are told by Sir Joseph Pope, are nearly all in the handwriting of those who moved them, and it was evidently the intention to prepare a complete record. The conference was, however, much hurried at the close. So who were these people who decided for the whole of a continent almost, that this is what should be done? Decided in complete secrecy, without any input whatsoever from Canadians. The list of delegates, who are now styled the Fathers of Confederation, were 12 delegates from Canada, from Nova Scotia, 5 delegates, from New Brunswick, 7 delegates, from Prince Edward Island, 7 delegates, from Newfoundland, 2 delegates. That's not a lot of people. They're all, of course, men, and of a certain background. The Constitution which the founders of the Dominion devised, these representatives, was the first of its kind on a great scale within the empire. No English precedents, therefore, existed. And remember, there were no legal minds assisting to draw and point towards any precedents that might have proven helpful or may have needed to have been followed. Yet their chief aim was to preserve the connection with Great Britain. It is to the glory of the Fathers of Confederation that the Constitution mainly constructed by themselves as the product of their own experience and reflection, has lasted without substantial change for nearly half a century. Remember, in their experience and reflection, not assisted by any formal, legal constitutional advice and background. During the debates on Confederation in the Canadian Assembly in the following year, and this is once the Constitution's in effect, MacDonald derided the notion that a government would ever overrule the independent opinion of the upper house, this is the Senate, by filling it with a number of its partisans and political supporters. This, however, is precisely what has taken place. The Senate is one of the few unsatisfactory creations of the Fathers of Confederation. Houses met in January of 1865, and the Governor-General used this language in his opening speech. This was the province of Canada at the time. No time was lost in placing the new Constitution before Parliament. With the public men of British North America, it now rests to decide whether the vast tract of country which they inhabit shall be consolidated into a state, combining within its area all the elements of national greatness, providing for the security of its component parts and contributing to the strength and stability of the empire, or whether the several provinces of which it is constituted shall remain in their present fragmentary and isolated condition, comparatively powerless for mutual aid and incapable of understanding their proper share of imperial responsibility. So again, I remind you, as Canada saw fit for itself to grow and unite and build and become and try to work towards becoming a nation, we have now Indigenous nations, on the advice of Canada and in their initiatives, trying to break down the Indigenous nations into these small, powerless components. It's very hypocritical. And it's important to remember that in the Confederation, it had nothing to do with Indigenous people. The scene presented by this chamber at this moment, I venture to affirm, has few parallels in history. 100 years have passed away since these provinces became by conquest part of the British Empire. Now the conquest, speaking of, is the conquest of New France. I speak in no boastful spirit. I desire not for a moment to excite a painful thought. What was then the fortune of war of the brave French nation might have been ours on that well-fought field. Now, it's important to understand that Confederation had nothing to do with Indigenous nations. Indigenous nationals were not considered part of this because they were their own foreign nation vis-a-vis Britain and vis-a-vis Canada. For example, when you look to when British Columbia was discussing and proposing how to join into the Dominion of Canada, it was, even though the Indigenous nationals were the vast majority, I think there was about 30,000 of them left. This is after smallpox, etc. But there were only like 1,000 actual quote-unquote Canadians, if you will. Even though I use that term, in terms of colonists, British colonists. Well, there were no treaty. Of course, the Indigenous nationals were not included. There were no treaties, for example, in British Columbia that even allowed for Her Majesty to exercise any partial political sovereignty. So, of course, having no treaty of capitulation, although now we have land claims that have done just that for some areas. Obviously, Indigenous nationals were not in mind. It was only in terms of obligations that under the British North American Act 1867, the city, in terms of, and remember a lot of the treaties 1 to 11 were not in place yet. Who was going to do those diplomatic negotiations? Who would be part of that? And who would fulfill the responsibilities of that were the only things that were considered. And here's an important thing to know. Why were not the terms of Confederation, This is the British North America Act 1867. It's since renamed the Constitution Act 1867 as the result of the Canada Act that established the Constitution Act 1982. So why were not the Terms of Confederation submitted to the Canadian people for ratification? The most strenuous fight was made in Parliament on this point, and in after years, too, constitutional writers, and this continues to this day, and I'm one of them, gifted with the wisdom which comes after the event, have declared the omission as a serious error. Goldwin Smith observed that Canadians might conceivably in the future discard their institutions as lacking popular sanction when they were adopted, seeing that in reality they were imposed on the country by a group of politicians and a distant parliament. Now, when they've tried to respond to that, as it was done, at this time, it says, voice the opinion. It says, well, stated impetuously, this is one representative, that not 5 members of Parliament in Upper Canada dare go before the people against the scheme. No petitions against it were presented, and its opponents had not ventured to hold meetings, knowing that an enormous majority of the people favored it. This evidence in Upper Canada was accepted as conclusive. In Lower Canada, appearances were not quite so convincing. So remember what I've emphasized. Canada and the provinces are busy creating evidence to support a conclusion that Indigenous nations no longer exist, if they ever did, and that Indigenous nationals themselves are the ones saying this and asking for these initiatives and asking to come under and be taken in as these lost refugees, these remnants of meandering subhumans, begging to be allowed in to Canada, in which case they'll be put into temporarily, I remind you, because this is controlled by, the legislatures and the parliament, temporarily to be brought in on a municipal basis, but ultimately to be assimilated and become just other provincial and Canadians, and losing any aspect of ownership of lands and resources. The method of ascertaining the popular verdict by means of a referendum was proposed, but rejected as unknown to the Constitution and at variance with British practice. So remember, they've just had the British North America Act, 1867, put in place. And they're saying, well, there was no provision for a referendum that had to be held. So, it's not constitutional. We don't have to do this. And we don't know of any British practice of doing this. So when I jump on things like a failure to set out specifics of a referendum and specifics of details of how to conduct those properly, to properly ascertain whether in fact the people grant their consent, remember what happens here. The people are required to apply for membership into the new club and say, yes, I'm part of this, in order to simply vote on whether it's something they want. Now that's very, it's very sneaky, it's very contrary to Indigenous law, it's a trick, and it just tells you how desperate they are. They know the people won't go for this stuff, so they have to make it up this way. So essentially, they're having Indigenous nationals give up their nationality and represent they're going to be part of this thing without even actually consenting to it. So the referendum itself having such low standards is because they've already surrendered and given up when they sign into that process. But if they don't sign into the process, how can they vote no, right? So they've got you whether you vote yes or no, because in order to vote, you have to capitulate as an individual. Do you see how horrible that is, and how unlawful and unconstitutional that is, and how that is only the action of Outlaw Nation, because the Crown has made very clear what's necessary to be met if the Indigenous nation is going to hand over any of what it has, what is required. And Canada is saying, well, if we get them to, sign in and be a member of this thing, and then they conduct the votes, then we've got them. Then no one can question the standard, this lower standard, 25% plus 1%, 25% plus 1, and then a second vote of, a handful of people can make it happen. You can't give away a country, a nation, that way. But if individuals are signing in and becoming part of this, then Canada's hoping that that's a demonstration. This is the people want this, despite the people having no idea. They have to register, even getting information. It's just ridiculous. So what can an individual do? An individual can either themselves or as part of a petition can say, no, this is who I am. I am a national of this nation. And I'm not talking your community. You're basically saying, I'm a national of this nation. I'm Anishinaabe, for example. I'm a resident in this Anishinaabe community known as an Indian band. And I adhere to our Indigenous law. I retain my right of consent. There's a number of things I would put in there. I won't get into all of that right now. But my point is that as individuals, you do not have to do as is being said is your only alternative. There are ways to do things that don't cost you money that can serve to counter the evidence base that Canada is constructing with the help of your own people. And this conclusion by this, historian, justify the belief that parliamentary tactics, rather than the pressure of public opinion, inspired the move. That's what created the Dominion of Canada. Not the people, not adherence to public opinion, but parliamentary tactics, practical steps, not lawful, not reflecting legal facts. Father, and this is someone who was, standing up against this from one of the provinces at the time. It says, he's City of St. John. A.R. Wetmore illustrated the dire effects of Confederation in an imaginary dialogue between himself and his young son after this fashion. Father, what country do we live in? And of course the reply came promptly, my dear son, you have no country, for Mr. Tilley has sold us all to the Canadians for 80 cents a head. Canada still has a price on your head. What's shocking is how low the price is when, they get you through the self-government and piecemeal initiatives. Because under land claims as a whole, the prices, per head is a lot higher. And they do indeed calculate the compensation on a per head basis. And it reflects what was done back then. I mean, this is the sort of thing that was happening. And so even Canadians themselves in the province said, look, we're not going to be part of that, and they weren't until later. Prince Edward Island made another contribution to the chapter of misfortune of the Constitution by definitely rejecting the proposed union. The Legislative Council unanimously passed a resolution against it, and in the Assembly the adverse vote was 23 against 5. It was declared that the scheme would prove politically, commercially, and financially disastrous. An address to the Queen prayed that no imperial action should be taken to unite the island to Canada or any other province. The Canadian government took prompt measures. On the arrival of the bad news, and there was another example from New Brunswick, it was decided to hurry the debates to a close, prorogue Parliament, and send a committee of the Cabinet to England to confer with the imperial authorities on federation, defense, reciprocity, and the acquisition of the Northwest Territories. This program was adhered to. The 4 ministers who left for England in April were Macdonald, Brown, Galt, and Cartier. The mission, among other results pertinent to the cause of union, secured assurances from the home authorities that every legitimate means for obtaining the early assent of the maritime provinces would be adopted. Now, from 1862 onwards, there was no mistaking the policy of Downing Street as expressed by the Duke of Newcastle in that year to the Governor of Nova Scotia. Colonial secretaries came and went, and the complexion of British ministries changed, but the principle of union stood approved. In other words, home country, Britain, liked the idea of a union of the provinces to become the Dominion of Canada. But the principle of union stood approved. Any proposals, however, must emanate from the colonies themselves, and when an agreement in whole or in part should be reached, the proper procedure was indicated. Canada remains bound by the proper procedure that exists between that the Crown demands in terms of dealings with Indigenous nations. All this attempt to circumvent that is the actions of an outlaw nation developing. Canada started on the foundation of let's just do this, no matter whether it's legal or not, whether the people agree or not, we're just going to do this. And now Canada is applying that same attitude in the provinces, continue to provide that same attitude. We're just going to do this. It's not lawful, but we're just going to do in the Indigenous nations. It's not lawful internationally or domestically, but we're just going to do it. What happens next? Are Canadians really protected from that attitude that carries on in this country today? The next step is this pushing on the basis of saying, oh, this is going to help Indigenous people, pushing to remove the monarchy, right? Why does Canada need to remove the monarchy? Because the monarchy upholds these principles that must be met. Those principles protect the Indigenous nations. It dismays me to no end to read on social media that some Indigenous nationals think and are buying this, that, oh, our problem is with the Queen. We need to just get rid of the monarchy. Are you crazy? The monarchy there is one of your protections. The problem is the Canadian governments that are acting as they are and see no problem with it. Because why? It's the foundation of this country. Canada started that way and has continued that way, and nobody's held Canada accountable. Only the Indigenous nations can do so, and only through reliance on their existing relationship with the Crown, as was just described here. And again, I won't go through all of the examples, but it just says, the next step, felt intimidated, the occurrence, felt unable at the time to explain their altered attitude to the legislature. The next step involved proceedings still more unusual, if not actually unconstitutional. And it describes what took place that actually forced the government to have to resign because of what was done in the speech. Throne speech. And again, the British minister at Washington, Sir Edward Thornton, responded to a proposal that Canada should be ceded to the United States was merely that Great Britain could not thus dispose of a colony against the wishes of the inhabitants. So, the Crown requires certain processes and procedures and protocols. Canada doesn't think it needs to do that or follow that, and doesn't think that Indigenous nationals know anything about this stuff and know how to deal with it. Because after all, with the greatest of respect, the technicians they've had, the same ones for decades now, haven't been able to tap into this, don't know how to do this, don't know what to do. They just keep pointing the finger and saying, oh, Canada needs to follow the decisions of the courts. Where the reality of it is, those courts are part of Canada, and those decisions are actually what Canada is following. The fact that you might not know, a technician doesn't know how to do something, doesn't mean that there isn't something that needs to be done. There's lots that needs to be done. And talking even about the name, it was desired to call the Confederation the Kingdom of Canada, and thus fix the monarch basis of the Constitution. And so they were trying, you know, they figured, well, that might upset the United States. So then it says that Dominion was under consideration. A member of the conference, well versed in the scriptures, found a verse which, as a piece of descriptive prophecy, at once clinched the matter. Quote, "And his dominion shall be from sea even to sea, and from the river even to the ends of the earth." Quoting from the Bible, Zechariah 9:10, 9 being in Roman numerals. But no one appears to have realized that, and then getting back to the problem with the Senate, that the Senate would become the citadel of a defeated party until sufficient vacancies by death should occur to transform it into the obedient instrument of the government of the day. No one foresaw in truth that the Senate would consider measures chiefly on party grounds and would fail to demonstrate the usefulness of a second chamber by industry and capacity in revising hasty legislation. The delegates actually believed that equality of representation between the three divisions, Upper Canada, Lower Canada, and the Maritime provinces, would make the Senate a bulwark of protection to individual provinces. In this character, it has never shone. Its chief value has been as a reservoir of party patronage. And that's, you know, precisely one of the drawing cards for these self-government organizations. You know, they expect that they're going to have certain positions as a result. The Constitution of Canada was thus the creation of the colonial statesmen themselves, and not of the imperial government or parliament. And of course, the first how the first government came into place after that. Before the delegates left London, the Governor-General privately invited John A. Macdonald to form the first ministry of the Dominion. The Canadian people, I do believe at best, and who am I quoting here? This is in a letter to the Governor-General, putting himself on record, one of the representatives. I do believe, but I believe the best, indeed the only way, is to teach the Canadian people to look forward to an independent existence as a nation in the future as desirable and possible. Again, not a nation working towards it, but look at how they're building the nation. Look at the tactics. Look at what they're trying to do. Contrast that to how governance and nation had evolved and existed for thousands of years for Indigenous nationals. This was an interesting point, just kind of out there, that I wasn't aware of. In the early years of the Dominion, a member might sit both in the House of Commons and in the legislature of his province. So you could be both an MLA and a member of Parliament. You know, and this again, Nova Scotia, right, frequently asserted that the question of union should have been submitted to a vote of the people. Such a course, owing to the circumstances already narrated, was impracticable and would have been fatal to Confederation. So interesting. They knew that the people were not in support of Confederation, because if they were going to put it to a vote, the opinion was it would be fatal to Confederation. So it wasn't practical to do that, because these individuals wanted Confederation. It's the same thing that is being, that the Indigenous nationals are being subjected to today. They don't want to come under Canada. They've been very clear about that. But there are individuals amongst them that want to, because, you know, they're being quite frankly bribed by the positions and titles and probably suitcases of money, because that was a common practice of Canada. And I'll conclude with this. It says, you know, the belief was inherent in the beneficent rule of Queen Victoria. There was a constitutional sovereignty which would appeal irresistibly to a young democracy. That unwavering fidelity to the crown could be reconciled with the fullest extension of self-government. Well, that's what's under attack right now for Canada. Canadian governments are orchestrating that, to get rid of that last piece, because they're having a feeling that they're not going to be able to do in the Indigenous nationals and the nations, and with that have the treaties fall so that the land could come into the hands of the Crown and then be controlled by the Prime Minister as a Privy Council. So what to do if you can't get it that way? If people like me are evidencing that what you're doing is manufactured contrary to the Constitution you're bound by, it's an action of an outlaw nation, you can't do that, you have treaties, you're bound by those. Well, if you can't do in the Indigenous Nations to get those treaties to fall, then you try to oust the Crown. You try to have that revolution to remove the Crown. But it'd be probably more of a quiet revolution with the passing of royal proclamations that try to hand off more and more until such time as Canada says, well, Canadians say, we really don't need the Queen, they'll buy that BS, and then it will be done. In which case, we now would have a Canada that is not bound by anything. They've gotten away with all of that. What more will they do, and can they do? There are no real checks and balances, because the operation by convention, the power in the hands of one, the new King of Canada, if you will, that's a scary concept. If people wonder, why am I so intent on preserving Indigenous nations and the treaties, etc., me not being outwardly looking as one of them, although I do carry certain commitments and responsibilities and authorities to speak. It's that I'm worried about the future of Canada in terms of my being a Canadian, my child being a Canadian, and where that takes us. And I have seen, and I'll share in future episodes, what can happen in this country to individuals who do not play along, who do not, and this is at professionals yet, right, as a lawyer, what happens when you don't do as you're told. And that's all I have to say for now.